It is said that clothes speak volumes about a person's personality and taste. However, in medieval Europe, dress codes were imposed upon different classes of people of the society. Their clothing styles were strictly regulated by class, gender or status in the social hierarchy. From 1294 to the time of the French Revolution in 1789, there existed laws that were strictly followed by the French. These laws were known as the sumptuary laws. These laws put restrictions on the lower classes of society. They prevented them from wearing certain clothes, consuming certain foods and alcohol, and hunting in certain areas. Strangely, in medieval France, the number of clothes that a person could buy in a year was also regulated. Regulation was based not only on a person's income, but also his social rank. Even the fabrics that people could use for clothing was governed by law. Only the royal class wore expensive material like ermine, fur, silk, velvet, and brocade, which reflected aristocracy, while the lower classes were forced to wear clothes made from cheap materials. However, with the French Revolution, these existing dress codes began to vanish. Members of the Jacobin clubs proudly called themselves sans-culottes, meaning without knee breeches. They wore loose and comfortable clothes that distinguished them from the men belonging to higher classes and royal families who wore knee breeches. The colors of the French national flag, blue, white and red, were a common favorite to express their feeling of patriotism. Other political symbols, too, became a part of their dresses. Some of these symbols included the red cap of liberty, also known as the Phrygian cap, long trousers, and the revolutionary cockade pinned onto a hat. People now wore simple clothes to express their idea of equality. The French Revolution helped get rid of the restrictions of the sumptuary laws that had reinforced social hierarchies. The French Revolution ended the sumptuary laws. However, it did not ensure that everyone had a similar clothing style. The poor still could not dress or eat like the rich. It was a person's earnings that determined what he or she could wear. And so, different classes of people developed their own styles of dressing. This is how the notion of what was beautiful or ugly, proper or improper, decent or vulgar differed. The clothing styles of men and women reflected what was expected out of them by society. While men presented themselves as serious, strong, independent and aggressive, women were expected to be docile, delicate, frivolous and passive. Women in Victorian England were therefore groomed accordingly since their childhood. As girls, they were dressed in stays that held their bodies together. As they grew slightly older, they wore tight-fitting corsets, which would make their waists appear smaller and give shape to their bodies. Although wearing stays and corsets were painful, women were compelled to do so, since it was believed that tightly laced women with small waists were attractive, elegant, and graceful. However, not all women wanted these sufferings. By the 1830s in England, the suffrage movement gathered momentum and women started campaigning for dress reforms as well. Several articles by the reformers were published in women's magazines describing the ill effects of corsets on bodily development. Even doctors reported that many women who wore corsets experienced weakness and lethargy and fainted frequently. A similar movement began in the East Coast of America. Women criticized their long skirts and voluminous traditional clothes since it accumulated dirt and also hampered free movement. The first dress reformer, Mrs. Amelia Bloomer, launched loose tunics that could be worn over ankle-length trousers. The trousers were known as bloomers or knickerbockers. In the 1870s, two associations strongly campaigned for dress reform. These were the National Woman Suffrage Association, headed by Mrs. Stanton, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, commanded by Lucy Stone. They demanded simple dresses and short skirts and the abandonment of corsets. Both in Europe and America, women began a movement for rational dress reform. Initially, the reformers faced a lot of opposition from the conservative women. Some of them even changed back to their traditional style of clothing. However, by the end of the 19th century, the notion of beauty and clothing changed. Conservative people began accepting the ideas of the reformers. Over the centuries, clothing followed strict rules, and the style was generally uncomfortable for women. However, by the end of the 19th century, several changes took place in Britain. This was due to the introduction of new technologies and fabrics, as well as the working conditions of women. Life was different before the 17th century for women in Britain. They owned few clothes made of flax, linen or wool, which were also very difficult to clean. However, the start of the 17th century brought a fresh new change to clothing. The trade with India introduced British to inexpensive and beautiful Indian shins, which was also easy to maintain. This inflow of new fabric increased the size of the wardrobe of many Europeans. During the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, Britain also began to manufacture and export cotton textiles worldwide, including India. This made cotton clothes very popular all over Europe. After cotton, the next wave of change came about a century later. Clothes made of artificial fiber arrived in the market. Compared to cotton clothes, these were cheaper and easier to maintain. Apart from the cloth, the clothing style also changed by the late 1870s. Women welcomed lighter, shorter, and simpler clothes. The two world wars also impacted women's clothing style tremendously. From the 13th century till 1914, women would wear ankle-length clothes. However, by 1915, their skirts became mid-calf length for practical reasons. Social barriers broke down due to the wars, and European women stopped dressing lavishly. All women looked more or less similar and wore sober colors. Their clothes became plainer and simpler, and skirts became shorter. Women also began to wear trousers for easy movement. Almost 7 lakh women in Britain were employed in ammunition factories during the First World War. They wore uniforms that consisted of blouses, trousers and scarves, which were later replaced by khaki overalls and caps. Some women even cut their hair short for convenience. By the 20th century, clothes began to reflect seriousness. Children were taught the importance of simple dressing and ornamentation was discouraged. Besides, working women also participated in sports, and so they wore clothes that were comfortable and convenient. The passage of time brought new values which made clothing simpler, plainer, practical, and more comfortable. Along with Europe and America, colonial India also showed significant changes in men's and women's clothing. When Western-style clothing was introduced in the 19th century, it brought out different reactions in people. While some Indians, influenced by the West and missionary activities, adopted Western clothing, others ridiculed this new change as a loss of traditional and cultural identity. Still others combined the Western and Indian forms of dressing to avoid dilemmas. Men, particularly, incorporated some elements of Western-style clothing in their dress. The rich Indian Parsis were the first to adopt Western-style clothing. They wore baggy trousers, long collarless coats, fentas or hats, and boots. Evidently, some people believed that Western clothes were a sign of modernity and progress. Western clothing also appealed to many Dalit groups who converted to Christianity. Interestingly, some men wore Western-style clothes to work and traditional clothes at home. This difference in clothing at work and home is observed till today. However, the changes in clothing have a turbulent history. Though sumptuary laws did not exist in India, the caste system defined what the lower and the higher castes could wear or eat. People had to abide by these laws, and any attempt to change their clothing style led to violent social reactions. In the year 1822, in Travancore, the lower caste Shanars, also known as Nadars, worked under the Nair landlords. Shanar men and women did not cover the upper half of their bodies. However, some Shanar women who converted to Christianity began wearing blouses. This annoyed the Nairs and led to major riots in the state. Finally, the government declared that Shanar women, whether Christian or Hindu, could wear blouses as long as these did not resemble the blouses worn by the women of the higher castes. The British rule also had its impact on clothing in India. Some clothing had specific significance. Because the cultures of the Indians and the British were different, this often created misunderstanding and conflict. Consider the case of a turban and a hat. For Indians, the turban signified respect and could not be removed at will. Whereas in Western tradition, the hat had to be removed before social superiors as a sign of respect. The British were offended if Indians did not take off their turbans when they met colonial officials. Shoes also caused conflicts. Removing one's shoe before entering a home or a sacred place was considered a sign of respect in India. Initially, British officials followed Indian etiquette and removed their shoes in the courts of ruling kings or chiefs. Later, Governor-General Lord Dalhousie demanded the same shoe respect which the Indians had to strictly follow when entering a government institution or courtroom. Only those who wore Western dresses were exempted. Indians were against removing their shoes outside the courtroom since it was a public building and not a sacred place. Several arguments took place between the British and the Indians on shoe respect. However, it took several years before shoes were permitted into courtrooms. With the passage of time, many transformations took place in colonial India. How should we design India's national dress? This was the thought that engaged Indians for a long time during the nationalist movement. The men as well as the women of the upper classes experimented to define India's national dress that expressed the unity of the nation. At the beginning of the 1870s, the Tagore family of Bengal experimented with dress designs. Rabindranath Tagore suggested that the national dress should combine elements of Hindu and Muslim dress. And thus, the chapkan, which is a long buttoned coat, was considered a suitable dress for men. It was Jnana Dhananandani Devi, wife of Satyendranath Tagore, who first adopted the Parsi style of wearing a sari in the late 1870s. This sari was pinned to the left shoulder with a brooch and worn with a blouse and shoes. This style was then adopted by Brahmo Samaji women and hence came to be known as the Brahmika sari. Soon, this style was accepted by Brahmos and non-Brahmos in Maharashtra and Uttar Pradesh. However, this style of dressing did not appeal to the women of Gujarat, Kodagu, Kerala and Assam, who wore different types of saris. While some upper classes were experimenting with dresses, the Swadeshi movement brought in a political aspect to dressing. In the 17th century, India manufactured 1/4 of the world's goods. However, after the Industrial Revolution, Britain started manufacturing cheap milk cloth. This greatly affected the Indian cotton industry. In 1905, Lord Curzon decided to partition Bengal to control the growing opposition to the British rule. This gave rise to the Swadeshi movement. In this movement, the Indian masses boycotted British goods and adopted goods manufactured in India. The use of khadi over British manufactured clothes became a patriotic duty. Songs and poems were written to popularize its use. However, as khadi was expensive, it appealed more to the upper classes. Those who found khadi uncomfortable continued using British mill-made cloth. However, 15 years later, many upper-class people started wearing Western dresses again. Although many people rallied for Swadeshi goods, it was impossible to compete with the cheap British goods that had flooded the market. Despite its limitations, for Mahatma Gandhi, the experiment with Swadeshi cloth also proved to be a symbolic weapon against the British rule. Mahatma Gandhi had different clothing styles in his earlier days. From a shirt pajama and coat in his childhood days to Western-styled clothes at the beginning of his professional life in South Africa. However, later, he decided that dressing unsuitably was a more powerful political statement. A year after the non-cooperation movement in 1921, he started wearing only a short khadi dhoti. The white, coarse khadi signified purity, simplicity, and poverty. Also wearing it became a symbol of nationalism. a rejection of Western mill-made cloth. Gandhiji wore this short dhoti without a shirt when he went to England for the Round Table Conference in 1931. He refused to compromise and wore the same dress when he met King George V at the Buckingham Palace. Although Gandhiji dreamed that the entire nation should wear khadi, there were some who felt differently. These included the rich nationalist Motilal Nehru, who wore finer Indian clothes, Dalits like Baba Saheb Ambedkar, who wore Western suits, Sarojini Naidu and Kamala Nehru, who wore coloured saris, and other common people who could not afford the expensive khadi cloth. Thus, dress experiments by different people contributed to the search for an Indian national dress.